Hi everyone. For my professional development workshop, I decided to work on guided reading. I think that when teachers learn about the components of a balanced literacy block, guided reading is always mentioned as one of the best instructional practices that teachers have to help students become proficient in reading. As a literacy coach, I want to teach other teachers what guided reading is, but most importantly, how to implement it effectively in their classroom. In my presentation, you will hear about the literature review, the goals and objectives for my sessions, the outline for each of the 5 sessions, and the evaluation questions that I came up with. Guided reading is one of the major components of the balanced literacy block. It provides differentiated, small group instruction to a group of students with similar strengths and instructional needs. This instructional tool provides teachers a systematic and open-ended framework that allows them to evaluate students' needs and build on their strengths. The goal of guided reading is for students to develop a system for reading that lets them discover the process of reading while reading. Every lesson is different because it provides learning in different ways, with elements that have a specific function and related to each student's ability to construct meaning, which leads to a solid base to build comprehension. Creating small groups fosters social interactions among students, which creates cognitive stimulus and gives them opportunities to form and justify opinions with guidance from the teacher. Guided reading helps develop students as individual readers, develop literacy strategies that enables them to read increasingly difficult texts, enjoy successful experiences reading for meaning, and develop the behaviors that facilitate comprehension to become independent readers. For this instructional practice to be successful, teachers must implement a classroom structure that allows them to work with a group while the rest are engaged in independent work. Teachers are to work with students as they develop strategies to make them successful readers. They can also use a modified version of guided reading for English language learners in which they receive additional support to make meaning of what they are reading. Guided reading provides students with establishing good reading strategies and habits. It is important to understand that this practice is not just about what students are being taught, but how. Teachers need to model and explain strategies, draw attention to text features, and model how students can use strategies to create their own meaning of text. This approach provides teachers with the opportunity to teach explicit skills that will lead to reading proficiency. The teacher must decide what is the next powerful strategic activity for each group of students to increase their processing of information in text. The goals and objectives for the sessions that I developed are for teachers to learn what is guided reading, why it's important, what does the guided reading block look like, how to create groups for guided reading, how to plan, how to teach, and how to teach English language learners through guided reading. In session number 1, I want teachers to know what guided reading is, if they don't already know, why it's important to implement it in the classroom, and what the block would look like. The activity that I would have them do on this first session would be just taking some notes and then discuss the questions that you can see on the screen, which are, if you already implement guided reading, how does this model compare? If you have never implemented guided reading, what would you like to leave this session knowing? Why do you think it's important to implement guided reading in your classroom? So in this session, attendees would get an introduction to what guided reading is, the research behind it, and how it has been successful. They will also learn about the importance of implemented guided reading in the classroom. Lastly, they would get an introduction to how the classroom would look like while this is happening and what everyone would be doing, what the students would be doing, what the teacher would be doing. And for the activities, they would have a handout with some of the important information, which would include space for notes and maybe completing some of the information that is being shared so that they can be engaged. For session number 2, I would do how to create groups for guided reading. I think this is an important part of it, and attendees will be looking at a triangulation of data to create their guided reading groups. I will show them how to pull reports for independent reading levels and other meaningful reports that may be used in that specific campus or district. If I would be doing the session in my own campus, we would use Renaissance 360 data, which provides a proficiency level for students after taking a test on the computer. I would also use this data from a test that students have taken, like a district assessment or a mock star, and have these three pieces of data to create groups. I would then show them how to group students according to the information that we have collected, and explain that usually there's 5 groups in one rotation, and it depends on how many different levels of students you have. There could be more groups or less groups. So the activity would be triangulate the data to create groups, and we would also have discussion questions that you can see on the screen. What should you use to create guided reading groups? Why can groups change throughout the school year? How many students should there be per group? How many groups can you have in a rotation? In session number 3, I would teach them and help them plan for a guided reading lesson. Teachers will take a look at actual planning tools for the lesson. Now that they have at least a few groups created, they will be able to create a lesson for them. First, we would check what skills students need to work on and their independent reading level. Attendees will know by now that during guided reading, the teacher would be using text that is one level above their independent level. I would have books from the Scholastic level Library, which is one of the resources that we use at my campus, or from the LLI toolkit that I talked to you about in my last project. And both of these tools include lesson guidance. I would then show them how to break it down into several days of instruction, because you don't want to do one lesson in one day, because it would be too much. So the activity would be plan for a guided reading lesson and then discuss the questions that you also see on the screen. What are the components of a guided reading lesson? How can I break a lesson into several small lessons? How do I know what skills my students need to work on? And is there a template for planning guided reading lessons? On session number 4, I would begin by explaining how the lesson is taught and how long each component should be. I would then model a guided reading lesson to the teachers. After, I would like to have a few volunteers model a guided reading lesson that they have created with a group, so that they can get feedback from the group and they could get feedback from me. This way they could make changes, and then it would be an at-bat. So they would be using us as we were students, and we would act as if we were students so that they can see how it would work. So the activity, again, it would be teaching a guided reading lesson and discussing the questions. What does a guided reading lesson look like? What components are taught during the guided reading lesson? And how can I make my lesson better? On the last session, I would teach them the modifications that they need to teach guided reading to English language learners, which I thought was very interesting because I'd never seen these modifications before. I've always seen the way the standard guided reading lessons. I do have a lot of ELLs in my classroom and my school, so I think this was a great find because it will allow us to really target those students at the level that they need. So for me, this would be one of the most important sessions, and it would be similar to session number 4. However, I would explain the modifications that they can apply to English language learners, such as having more time, more vocabulary front loading, culturally relevant text, word recognition prompts, more word work on morphological awareness. So again, the activity would be creating a guided reading lesson that would be modified for English language learners. And the questions that I came up with are how would the two lessons be similar and different? the standard and the one for English language learners. And then why is it important to differentiate instruction for these two populations? Lastly, my evaluation, I came up with 8 questions. The first 5 questions would be rated on a scale of 1 through 5, and the last three, they would have space to write. The first question is, do you feel more knowledgeable about guided reading? Did you learn strategies you can implement in your classroom? Was the material presented useful to you for implementation? Were the activities beneficial to your learning? What did you think of the overall quality of these sessions? What part of the sessions was most effective? What part of the sessions was least effective? How can I support you to help you implement this in your classroom? These are the references that I used in my literature review. And thank you for listening.